Let's bypass the exhausted tales of kings, conquests, and battlefields right out of the gate. In this explainer, we're going to reconstruct an entire human world through the lived sensory reality of ordinary people in the early medieval North. We're literally looking closely at the very fabric of their daily existence.
To truly understand this era, we have to ask a pretty fundamental question. How did everyday people engineer their survival against the absolute harshest of climates? Without sacrificing their personal presentation, their social order, or their economy? Well, the answer isn't forged in iron. It's woven right into their textiles. First things first, we've got to completely discard that modern pop culture myth of dirty barbarians stomping around in drab leathers and horned helmets. The archaeological reality, it's entirely different. We are actually looking at a society of fastidiously groomed, brightly dressed climate engineers who were deeply invested in exactly how they presented themselves. I mean, their dedication to cleanliness was legendary. Saturdays in Old Norse were known as laugardag, which literally translates to washing day. Ordinary freemen carried bone combs, nail cleaners, and little ear spoons right on their belts. This daily grooming regimen was so meticulous it actively scandalized their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. English chroniclers actually complained that these, quote, ostentatious hygiene habits were making the Norsemen way too attractive to local English women.
But if they cared so much about their clothing, why do we constantly picture them in rags? Well, mostly because organic textiles just rot away in the earth. So our methodology relies on incredibly fragmented evidence. We're talking microscopic fibers preserved chemically by metal corrosion literally etched into the backs of silver brooches, or whole garments lucky enough to be unearthed from the oxygen-deprived muck of waterlogged bogs and trading centers like York and Hedeby.
And what those fragments tell us is brilliant. This was a highly structured world. The Old Norse poem Rigsula outlines a strict social hierarchy, and your place in it was instantly broadcasted by the fabric on your back. Whether you were an enslaved thrall, a free carl working the farm, or a noble jarl, the volume, quality, and ornamentation of your clothing told everyone exactly where you stood legally and economically.
Section 1. Engineering for extreme climates.
Moving beneath that social hierarchy, everyday garments were basically highly sophisticated technologies engineered for survival. Right against the skin, they wore the skarta, a linen shirt. An incredible 11th century example found in Viborg, Denmark, shows this expertly tailored, slim-fit garment with a really sophisticated poncho cut. It had zero shoulder seams to chafe under heavy labor, and it was designed for moisture-wicking comfort, pulling sweat away from the body without bunching up under those heavy outer layers. Over that linen, they layered wool spun from local sheep to handle the freezing rain. Now, these sheep had a dual-coated fleece, which is fascinating. The outer hairs, called tug, were long, coarse, and naturally coated in water-resistant lanolin. The inner wool, the thell, was soft, downy, and highly insulating. By spinning these two together, they basically created a prehistoric Gore-Tex, combining a water-repellent outer shell with a thermal inner layer. For their extremities, so heads, hands, and feet, they used a really amazing ancient technique called nail binding, or needle binding. This predates modern knitting by a long shot. It used a single, flat, blunt bone noodle to draw lengths of wool through existing loops, creating a super dense, interlocking, and highly insulated fabric. The 10th century Coppergate sock found in York is a perfect example of this. Unlike modern knitting, which, will unravel completely if a single thread snaps, a now-bound garment is made of self-locking loops. So if a thread snagged on a sharp rock or a splintered ship's timber, the rest of the structure stayed entirely intact. It kept feet warm even when soaking wet in the bottom of a freezing longship. Section 2, the sensory reality. Vibrant dyes of the North. Now, this utilitarian engineering was absolutely not devoid of color. Dyers back then really mastered the chemistry of the earth. They extracted brilliant yellows from weld and vivid reds from madder root. And because plant pigments don't naturally just stick to raw wool, they used mineral mordants, like alum found naturally in club moss, to chemically and permanently bind these vibrant colors right into their threads.
Getting the color blue from the woad plant, though, that was a highly complex and incredibly pungent process. The leaves were crushed and dried into these dense little balls. But to release the chemical reduction for the indigo pigment, those dried leaves had to be dissolved in warm, fermented human urine. Yeah, the smell of a Viking Age dyeing workshop would have been, well, truly unforgettable.
Yet, despite all that labor and the awful smell, blue was a highly prestigious color. And surprisingly, microscopic analyses of Norwegian undergarments have confirmed that woad-dyed fibers were sometimes used in the hidden layers of ordinary people's dress. It wasn't always just for public flexing, you know? Sometimes the luxury of color was purely a private comfort.
Section 3. The Women's Textile Economy.
The sheer mastery of these complex processes points us to the macroeconomic engine of this era, which was controlled completely within the domestic sphere. On farms all across the north, women operated out of a structure called the dongya. This was a specialized, partially subterranean pit house, dug right into the earth to maintain the perfect humidity needed for weaving. Inside this sensory world of damp earth, pungent lanolin, and the rhythmic thumping of the loom, women transformed raw agricultural outputs into the literal fabric of their society. Their primary output for daily wear was something called vavmal, a really rugged, dense twill cloth. But vavmal transcended mere clothing. In Iceland and the North Atlantic colonies, it was so highly standardized by law that it actually evolved into a formal legal currency. To use this cloth money to, say, pay your taxes, settle a fine at the Althing Assembly, or even buy a cow, women had to weave the vavmal to an exact, legally mandated standard. We're talking strictly 4 to 15 warp threads per centimeter. A single flawed weave, that basically meant your money was counterfeit. So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. The women working those warp-weighted looms down inside the Dyungja were essentially minting the money that drove the massive trade networks of the Northern Empire. Their domestic labor quite literally funded the expansion of the Viking world. Section 4. The Skoldahan Endigwar. Yet even with all this wealth of systemic knowledge, the specific human reality of the past can still be beautifully elusive. Take the Skoldahan costume, for example. Deep in a peat bog on Endoya in northern Norway, researchers uncovered a remarkably complete set of layered clothing, an inner tunic, an outer tunic, a hood, and leg wrappings. It was all found on a slender body, wrapped in a checkered blanket and laid on a reindeer skin, dating back to roughly 1050 to 1090 AD. Decades later, scholars are still fiercely divided over who this person actually was. The clothing features this really complex mix of both Norse and indigenous Sami styles. DNA analysis showed no Y chromosomes and no Sami-specific genetic sequences, which led some to claim it was a Norse woman. But as we know, genetic ethnicity doesn't always equal cultural identity. Was this a wandering Sami person, a Norse trader adopting local Arctic survival gear, or just someone living entirely between two worlds? The fact that they were buried in an unholy bog only deepens the mystery of this profound inter-ethnic exchange. By unweaving the garments of the past, we gain such a deeper understanding of the human condition. We're looking at a civilization built on astonishing resilience, profound domestic skill, and brilliant climate adaptation. We learn that history wasn't just forged by men swinging iron swords, it was, quite literally, spun on bone spindles by the hands of everyday survivors. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to ponder. When you look closely at the meticulous engineering, the vibrant chemistry, and the sheer economic power woven into a single woolen thread from 1,000 years ago, whose hands do you think were actually shaping the world?